tensions escalate with Iran, the United States is preparing to open a new front, this time in global trade. Washington has launched a fresh trade investigation under Section 301, targeting a group of major economies, including India. The probe will examine whether several countries are unfairly subsidizing their industries and flooding the US market with low-priced goods, hurting American companies. In total, the investigation covers 16 countries and regions, including India, China, and the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Singapore, Switzerland, Norway, and Mexico. The US government alleges that heavy state subsidies in these economies have led to overproduction, allowing companies to export goods to the United States at artificially low prices. The probe is being led by US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, who says that the investigation will determine whether the trade policies of these countries are harming American industries. Greer warned that new tariffs could be imposed as early as the summer of 2026 if the investigation finds evidence of unfair trade practices. The move comes just weeks after the US Supreme Court struck down a set of tariffs introduced by President Donald Trump, dealing a blow to the administration's earlier trade strategy. However, analysts say that the new Section 301 probe suggests Washington may now be pursuing a fresh route to reintroduce tariff pressure on global trading partners. If the investigation results in tariffs, it could potentially spark new trade tensions between the United States and several major economies, including India. And I'm being joined by my News 9 executive editor, Karthik Malhotra, with me on the broadcast. Karthik, now it looks like Washington is now looking at another route to reimpose their tariff pressure after the Supreme Court setback.
Absolutely. Trump never gives up, does he? I mean, they say Trump always chickens out, taco, but that doesn't seem to be the case as far as at least tariffs are concerned. So I think the U.S. administration led by U.S. President Donald Trump is finding ways and means and loopholes in the policy framework which can ensure that U.S. sort of offsets what it calls the trade deficit which it has with its trading partners, and really use any tool available in its arsenal to go ahead and attract those tariffs from countries. And the latest one, like you mentioned, Nancy, is Section 301. But do remember, the Section 301 penalizes countries, and it's a fairly potent tool. It penalizes countries which the US says use unfair means to supply excessive produced goods to the US economy. Now, obviously, there are sectors which are subsidized, key sectors which are subsidized by governments across the world. For example, China has a very robust manufacturing policy. India, on the other hand, has subsidized the agriculture sector for many decades now. And in addition to that, India also has its own performance-linked incentives, or the PLI, the production-linked incentive PLI scheme, for which again there are allocations. And then Taiwan, on the other hand, is the country which produces all the semiconductors and all the chips, the manufacturing of chips which use all the semiconductors produced by the world. You also have South Korea, you have Japan, which pretty much are the electronics makers of the world. So there are countries which prioritize certain sectors, certain industries, and ensure that those sectors receive some sort of government support. And it's exactly those sectors that Section 301 wants to go after. So at the end of the day, it seems that the US administration, led by Donald Trump, wants to ensure that even after the Supreme Court had struck down the emergency use of the president's powers to impose tariffs, country-specific tariffs on trading partners, and the administration doesn't seem to be happy with that 10% powers which the US has exercised. It wants to ensure that that tariffs start flowing in one way or another.
Well, Karthik, now the question is what happens to the existing trade deals with major economies, with the US partners, including India?
I think those trade deals are pretty much up in the air ever since the US Supreme Court struck down the emergency use of the president's powers to impose countrywide tariffs. I think those tariffs are gone, and along with those tariffs, those trade deals are also pretty much out of the question, because it is going to ensure renegotiation, and with the threat of those higher tariffs potentially off by the US Supreme Court's decision, countries, even though Donald Trump is saying that countries are still willing to honor, in fact, we've heard from the European Union also that they want to stick to the trade trade deal. Beyond that, we haven't really heard from other trading partners of the US that those trade deals which were inked continue to stay. And I think it is that anticipation which is driving the US administration to use these sort of tools available as part of its policy, Section 301 this time, to penalize countries which have excessive manufacturing capacity. Remember, all this ties back to the MAGA sort of aspirations of the Donald Trump administration. Want to make America great again, want to get jobs back in the country, and want to ensure that no other country benefits from the competitive advantages that country has built over US manufacturing.
Well, that's right. Karthik, should India be worried at this moment? Because at one point, India was one of the countries who was facing the highest tariffs from Donald Trump, and then it was slashed to 18%. And now this new move, is there a reason for India to be worried now?
I think China needs to be worried a little more than India. While I'm not saying India should not be worried, I think India should be worried as well. But I think the sort of target, the key target of this latest salvo coming from the US administration is primarily towards China, because remember, China is pretty much the factory of the world. And while US happens to be India's largest trading partner, India's manufactured output does not compete with China. So I think the salvo is really targeted at China this time. And this Section 301 has been used against China previously as well. If I take you back to 2018, when US-China trade war pretty much broke out for the first time, it was pretty much this same section, Section 301, which was used by the then US trade representative against China. Back in 2021, in fact, US had also used the same Section 301 against Ukraine, not for any excessive industrial capacity that Ukraine had, but towards a copyright infringement issue that US had with Ukraine. So the same Section 301 was used. So I believe 301 is not a threat. 301 has a precedence of having been used in the past and decisively sort of, favoring the US in the outcome of 301. So should India be worried? Yes, definitely. Should India be worried the most? I don't think so. I think countries like China and Taiwan happen to lose a lot more.
Well, Karthik, just for the viewers, can you explain what this Section 301 is and what are these unfair trade practices that the US is now looking to probe?
Right. So I think, my understanding and my reading tells me that Section 301 has got primarily two aspects to it. One aspect is under the broader sort of, umbrella of unfair trade practices. The first is where there is government support and where there is some sort of incentive available for companies to produce, excessive capacity of a certain good or a certain service. So government support enabling companies, private sector enterprises to produce more quantities of a certain variety of good or service is something which the US Section 301 sees as unfair. And the second is about trade practices, especially involving labor, which again, there are questions back more on China than on India. So Section 301 says that if there has been labor which has been employed and that labor has not been compensated fairly, or that labor is not, legally allowed to work in a particular setup, then Section 301 goes after that as well. So first up is government support for excessive capacity, and second is unfair labor utilization. These are two sections which Section 301 considers. So again, I think this comes back to bite China more than it bites India, because if you remember, there were these sort of low-cost fast fashion brands, one of them being Shein, which was prevented from listing on US markets because there were allegations that Shein was using labor, unpaid labor, underage labor, and not the best working conditions. So that is something which could, go ahead and hurt China, in addition, of course, to the subsidies which companies, industries enjoy. There were also cases, mind you, sometime last year, maybe 18 months back, where there were reports of labor not, meeting the best sort of living conditions in some of Apple's factories operating in India, the iPhone factories. But of course, the private sector as well as the government denied, and there were some investigations which did not really, bring out any critical aspects of labor not being dealt with fairly in India. But potentially the investigations which the US Trade Representative Jimson Greer in this case is going to conduct on these 16 countries could potentially also hinge on some of the manufactured output from India that goes into US.